Hello, Bravs. We're back with Grandmother's Stories. 4 years in New Salem. Page 70. Uncle Sam was building at this time, said Grandma. After each one had got into his or favorite position, a sailing vessel called the Salem Packet to carry passengers and freight from Buffalo to Mackinac and Green Bay. By the 1st of May, she was loaded and ready, and one bright morning sailed off with Uncle Sam and a crew of 3 men. Father went, too, to establish a store at Mackinac, as trade with the Indians and soldiers was profitable then as now. We children watched the boat sail out of the harbor with heavy hearts, and as she grew smaller and smaller in the distance, Abba and Sally could not restrain their tears. Mother was dead, and now Father was gone and would not be back for 6 months, and we felt very lonely and desolate. But Eber and I comforted them as much as we could, and told them that Father would be back in the fall, and that we must all be good and not cry, and not make our aunt more trouble than we could help. And Eber said, "We'll have some fun, too. I'll make a boat, and we'll go down and sail it in the creek," which he really did do, and had a great many happy days at the sport. "Oh," said the children, "I wish we had a creek to sail boats in. A bathtub is too small," and they looked for a minute as if they had never had any fun in their lives. "I helped our aunt about the housework, and mended the children's clothes," resumed Grandma, "and helped make new ones for us all, and learned everything I could so that I could keep house for Father when he came back. It doesn't seem as if I was ever a little girl after my mother died. I was 9 years old the month she died, and after that, it seems to me I always had the cares of a woman on my shoulders. I felt that I must attend to the children, that I must see to their clothes, but the making and the mending, take care of them when they were sick, and see that they were neat and clean and behaved well. And I will say that Eber and Abba never disobeyed me but once or twice in all their young lives. Sally thought sometimes I wasn't, but a year older than she was anyway, so I had to be more careful what I told her to do. I have often wondered since how it happened to be so, and I think they must have been remarkably good children." Here the aunties and mammas smiled at each other, as much as to say, "We know who was the remarkable child." In the fall, Father came back. We were down at the wharf to meet him, and though we were exceedingly glad to see him, we greeted him in the quiet and dignified way children were accustomed to use to their parents in those days. He brought us little mococks of maple sugar and pretty beadwork that the Indian women made, and other things that were useful. I showed him that what I had done for the children, and I felt the greatest pride and joy when he patted my head and called me his good little girl. It paid me for all the care and anxiety I had for the children, and helped drive away the continual pain I felt for the loss of my mother, that seemed to grow more instead of less. I suppose it was because the attempt I made to fill her place caused me to feel all the more keenly what we had lost. I know I could never speak of her death until long after I was a grown woman. Uncle Sam and his wife moved up to the village to spend the winter, and Father and we children kept house in their old house. I was the housekeeper, of course, and I had great pride in having everything as Father wanted, but you may be sure I had many a heartache before I was able to do things as well as Mother had done them. In the spring, Uncle Sam and his wife and several families moved to a place in the St. Clair River, where Uncle Sam had bought a large tract of land the year before. It was a beautiful peninsula with the St. Clair River on one side of it, and a pretty island stream, Bell River, on the other side. Across Bell River were a few French families, but except these, there were no inhabitants for some miles, unless it were a few Indians. After Uncle Sam and the people he took had been there a while, the place was called Yankee Point because the new settlers were all Yankees. Father went to Mackinac in the same boat they went in, and he left Abba and me to board with the family of Mr. Ford, and Sally and Eber boarded with a Mr. Gilbert. The Connuit creek ran between the two places, and in that creek Eber came very near being drowned. "Oh, tell us about it," said Porty and Eber Brock Jr., Eber B. Jr., with great eagerness. He and Abba were down there sailing toy boats when the very finest one got farther out into the stream than was anticipated, and Eber waded in after it. But the wind had got into the sail just right, and so the little boat kept ahead of him, and in his eagerness to get it, he got over his depth before he knew it, and down he went. When he rose to the surface, he was farther from shallow water than when he went down, and not knowing how to swim, after a struggle or two, he went down again. He sank a third time, and that time didn't rise. But in the meantime, Abba was screaming with all her might that Eber was drowning. And her screams brought some men from a field nearby. One of them, who was a good swimmer, plunged into the water, and after diving several times, found him lying placidly on the bottom of the creek, his little hands clutching the weeds that grew there. He brought him up, and they laid him across the knees of one of the men, face downwards, so that the water he had swallowed would run out of his mouth. And in a little while he began to open his eyes and to breathe. We children stood by crying, for when they brought him out of the water, we thought he was surely dead. "Were you there, Grandma?" said little Emily. "Oh, yes, I had heard the screaming, and was there almost as soon as the men were. After that, I was very careful to be with him when he went to sail his boats, for he would mind me when I told him not to do anything. And I wouldn't let him go far into the water. We had a very pleasant time that summer. Old Mr. Ford, with whom Abba and I lived, was an odd sort of man and very fond of onions. He wanted them every day, but if they weren't on the table, he wouldn't ask for them, and his wife very often forgot them, so every noon I used to put an onion, nicely cleaned, at his plate. I had no idea that he knew who did it, for children in those days were not praised for every little trifle they did. But when Father came home in the fall and went to pay our board, Mr. Ford wouldn't take any pay for mine. He said I was a thoughtful little girl and so good to him. And here he And here he related the onion story, that he didn't want any pay for me. "Hey, she gave me an onion every day." I'm sorry, I'll keep commentating to myself. Here the mammas looked at the children with meaning glances, as if they wished that trait of thoughtfulness for the happiness of others could be impressed upon their minds, and the children looked back with smiles, as if they understood it. "Of course that made me feel very happy," said Grandma. "We kept house as usual that winter, and the next spring Father went to Green Bay and stayed a whole year, and we 4 children boarded at a Mr. McNair's. When Father came back the following year, he bought a farm at Ruddville, a little way from Conneaut, but after it was all paid for and stocked and we were living on it, he found his title was a poor one. The man from whom he had bought it had left the country, and the complications of the title were such that only redress he had was to sue the state. Father thought he could not afford to do that, so he abandoned the farm, disposed of the stock at a sacrifice, and we went to Springfield in Pennsylvania, where he taught school. I felt the loss of the farm very keenly. Here, for the first time since Mother died, we had a home of our own, where Father intended to stay. Here I thought I could bring up the children and make them good and industrious. And here also would be a permanent home. No more moving every spring and every fall, and so I was bitterly disappointed. But we had a very pleasant time at Springfield. There was a good many girls and boys to go to school, sons and daughters of the farmers who lived in the neighborhood. They all had big farms and lived in the homely style of that day. I remember one funny incident that happened at that school, and as Grandma smiled, the children, one and all, wanted to know about it. There was a very odd boy, or young man he was, for he had got his growth, who came to school that winter. He wore a pair of leather breeches that were much too short for him, and they fitted as tight as a drum. They had been wet several times and had shrunk, so the wonder was how he could get into them at all. He was always late and would come lounging in, and when he got to his seat would thump upon it with a great thump, would fall upon it with a great thump. The boys thought they would cure him of that, so one morning they fixed a wooden peg in his seat, with the sharp point up, and watched for developments. They were not long coming, for at the usual hour he walked in, slouched lazily along to his seat, and dropped into it with his usual grace. But he bounded back like a rubber ball, and as he slapped the seat of his small clothes, he looked around on the convulsed scholars with an inexpressibly droll air, and drawled out, "Gall darn you, I know you, I know you." It is needless to say that he didn't fall down any more on that seat. The next fall, Father and Eber and I went up to Yankee Point to live, leaving the two girls in Conneaut in the care of a good woman. I wanted them to go with us, but Father said I was too young to manage growing girls. I didn't think I was too young, and I thought it would be better for them to be with us. But as I was only 13, I couldn't make much of an impression upon Father, and we sailed off without them. Motherless children have a great many trials that those who have mothers know nothing about. Men think they know a great deal, but a woman can keep her children together and bring them up better if the father dies than the father can if the mother dies. I felt the separation from them very much. Abba had always slept in my arms after Mother died, and I cried myself to sleep many a night after I left them. All right, Probs, that's all for today. Next time, a long ship ride.